Close your eyes and let me take you to a place where time moves like honey through amber, where the echoes of footsteps on wooden floors still whisper through the corridors of memory. Tonight, we journey not just through history, but through the soul of a man who carried the weight of a nation on shoulders that once split rails beneath the Kentucky sun. Imagine, if you will, the scent of wood smoke drifting across endless prairies, the soft creak of a log cabin settling into sleep, and the gentle breathing of a child who would one day hold the fate of millions in his weathered hands. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, not the marble statue, not the face on currency, but the man who walked through darkness to find light. But before we begin this journey together, if these whispered stories of the past speak to your heart, consider subscribing to the Dreaming of Past channel. Leave a comment and tell us what other souls from history you'd love to meet in the quiet hours of night. Your presence here, in this sacred space between waking and sleeping, means everything. Now, dim the lights. Let the world beyond these words fade away. Close your eyes and let your breathing slow. We're about to walk alongside a giant who began as nothing more than a boy with dreams bigger than his one-room world. Let the story wash over you like a gentle tide, carrying you to a time when America was young, torn, and desperately in need of healing. Listen and dream. In the beginning, there was only silence. The kind of silence that exists in the deep woods of Kentucky, where ancient trees stand like cathedral pillars, and the earth itself seems to hold its breath. It was here, in this sanctuary of shadow and whispered wind, that our story begins on a February morning in 1809, when the world was still painted in shades of winter gray. Picture, if you will, a single log cabin nestled in a clearing called Sinking Spring Farm. The logs, hewn by hand, fit together like prayers spoken in wood. Smoke curls from the chimney in lazy spirals, carrying with it the scent of burning oak and the warmth of human presence in an otherwise vast and lonely wilderness. Inside, by the glow of firelight that dances across rough-hewn walls, a woman named Nancy Lincoln cradles her newborn son against her chest. The baby's first breath mingles with the February air, cold and sharp as crystal. His eyes, when they open, seem to hold depths that speak of old souls and distant horizons. They name him Abraham, after his grandfather, a man who fell to Native American raiders in this very wilderness, his blood seeping into the same soil that now nurtures new life. Nancy Lincoln, with her gentle hands and sad, knowing eyes, whispers lullabies that float like ghosts through the cabin's single room. Her voice carries the weight of generations who have known hardship, who have carved meaning from the raw materials of survival. The baby listens, as if understanding that these melodies will be among his most treasured memories, woven into the fabric of his being like golden threads. Thomas Lincoln, the father, moves through these early days like a shadow cast by flickering flames. His hands, calloused from years of wrestling sustenance from unforgiving earth, now cradle his son with surprising tenderness. In the evenings, when the work is done and the fire burns low, he tells stories of the old country, of ancestors who crossed dark oceans in search of dreams they could barely articulate. The cabin breathes around them, expanding with the heat of day, contracting with the cold of night. Young Abraham learns the rhythm of this breathing, this dance between shelter and exposure, between the warmth of human love and the vast indifference of nature. He grows in increments measured not by calendars, but by the lengthening of shadows, the changing songs of birds, the slow transformation of seasons. When Abraham is 2, the family moves to Knob Creek Farm, 10 miles away. The journey, though short, feels like an exodus to other worlds. The new home sits in a valley where the creek runs clear and cold, carrying with it the music of stones worn smooth by countless years of patient water. Here, Abraham's sister Sarah joins their small constellation of souls, her presence adding new harmonies to the cabin's evening songs. Memory for the very young is a strange and fluid thing. Abraham's earliest recollections drift like smoke through the chambers of his mind. The taste of johnny cake warm from the griddle, the scratch of homespun against his skin, the way morning light filters through the gaps between logs to paint golden rectangles on the dirt floor. He remembers the sound of his mother's voice reading from the Bible, the only book in their possession, her finger tracing each word as if it were a sacred rune. The wilderness teaches its lessons in whispers and sudden revelations. Abraham learns that survival requires not just strength, but cunning, not just courage, but patience. He watches his father coax corn from reluctant soil, sees his mother transform the simplest ingredients into sustenance for body and soul. In the long winter evenings, when the wind howls like a living thing around the cabin's corners, the family huddles together, sharing warmth and stories that bind them closer than blood. But even in these early years, there are signs of the man Abraham will become. He listens with an intensity that seems to burn behind his dark eyes, absorbing not just words but the spaces between them, the emotions that flutter like moths around the flame of human speech. When neighbors gather for corn husking or barn raising, he positions himself at the edges of adult conversation, a small figure in the shadows, learning the rhythms of community, the delicate dance of cooperation that makes survival possible in this harsh and beautiful land. The creek becomes his teacher, its constant murmur a lesson in persistence and patience. He learns to read its moods, the way it swells with spring rains, the way it whispers secrets during the long drought of summer. Sometimes in the early morning, when mist rises like spirits from the water's surface, he sits on its banks and feels connected to something vast and eternal, something that transcends the narrow boundaries of his small world. Sleep comes easily to children in the wilderness, exhaustion earned through days of honest labor and simple play. Abraham learns to find rest on a mattress of corn husks, beneath quilts stitched by his mother's patient hands. In the darkness, he listens to the night sounds, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, the gentle breathing of his family. These sounds become the lullabies of his childhood, the soundtrack to dreams that will one day reshape a nation. As he grows from infant to toddler to small boy, Abraham carries within him the essence of this place, the smell of wood smoke, the taste of well water, the feel of earth beneath bare feet. The wilderness has claimed him, marked him as its own, and he will carry its lessons with him even when his path leads far from these quiet hills and whispering streams. The cabin at Knob Creek stands as a testament to the power of human determination, to the ability of ordinary people to create extraordinary meaning from the simplest materials. Within its walls, a future president learns his first lessons in democracy. The democracy of shared hardship, of mutual dependence, of love that transcends the boundaries of blood and circumstance. And in the evenings, when the fire burns low and the stars emerge like scattered diamonds across the vast Kentucky sky, Nancy Lincoln continues her gentle lullabies, her voice carrying across the years like a prayer, weaving dreams and possibilities into the sleeping mind of her remarkable son. There are sorrows that arrive like sudden storms, and there are sorrows that creep in like morning mist, so quietly that you don't notice them until they've already settled into your bones. The sorrow that visited the Lincoln family in the autumn of 1818 was of the first kind, swift, merciless, and final as winter. The malady called milk sick had been whispering through the settlements like a dark secret. It came without warning, carried by cattle who had grazed on the white snake root that grew in shadowed hollows. The poison moved through the milk, through the bodies of those who consumed it, silent and inexorable as fate itself. First, It claimed Nancy's aunt and uncle, the Sparrows, who had been like grandparents to young Abraham. Then, with the cruelty of a hunter who saves the most precious prey for last, it came for Nancy herself. Abraham, now 9 years old, watches from the corner of the cabin as his mother grows pale and weak. Her beautiful voice, which had filled their home with songs and stories, becomes a whisper. Her hands, which had sewn quilts and kneaded bread and smoothed his hair with such gentle strength, now tremble like autumn leaves. The firelight that once danced in her eyes grows dim, and Abraham understands with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children that something irreplaceable is slipping away. Nancy Lincoln dies on the October morning when the world is dressed in the colors of farewell. The maples wear scarlet like mourning clothes, and the oak trees stand draped in gold that seems to catch and hold the last warm light of the season. Thomas Lincoln, with his own hands and the help of neighbors, builds her coffin from green lumber. There is no time, no money for anything more elaborate. The wood weeps resin as if the very trees are grieving. They lay Nancy to rest on a gentle hill overlooking the valley, and Abraham stands beside the grave with dirt on his hands and tears on his cheeks. The preacher who will eventually come to speak words over her resting place is still days away, traveling the circuit that connects these scattered settlements like beads on a string. But Abraham speaks his own words, silent and fervent, promises that will echo through the years like prayers cast into an infinite sky. The cabin, once so full of warmth and laughter, now breathes with the rhythm of grief. Thomas Lincoln, overwhelmed by the dual burden of sorrow and responsibility, makes the decision that will change everything. They will leave Kentucky with its memories and its milk sick and seek new beginnings in the territory of Indiana. The wagon, loaded with their few possessions, creaks and groans as it carries them toward a future as uncertain as morning mist. The journey takes them through forests so deep that noon feels like twilight, across rivers that run cold and clear as liquid starlight. Abraham, walking beside the wagon to spare the oxen, feels each step taking him further from his mother's grave and deeper into the unknown. The wilderness of Indiana, when they finally reach it, feels different from Kentucky. Wilder, more ancient, as if the very trees remembered the footsteps of mastodons and the songs of peoples whose names have been forgotten by time. Little Pigeon Creek in Spencer County becomes their new home. Here Thomas Lincoln stakes his claim on 160 acres of forest so thick that axework becomes a form of prayer, each swing a petition to the gods of survival. Abraham, though still just a boy, learns to handle the axe with a grace that seems to flow from some deep well of natural ability. The rhythm of chopping becomes the metronome of his days, the foundation upon which his character will be built. The cabin they build here is more substantial than the one they left behind, but it too breathes with the life of the forest. The logs, fresh cut and heavy with sap, settle into place like old friends greeting each other after long absence. Abraham learns to read the personality of wood, the way oak speaks differently than hickory, the way pine whispers secrets that hardwoods keep to themselves. In the loneliness of that first winter, when the snow falls thick and silent as forgiveness, Thomas Lincoln makes a decision that will prove to be one of the most important of his life. He returns to Kentucky, to Elizabethtown, and comes back with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children of her own. The cabin, which had felt so empty after Nancy's death, suddenly overflows with the chaos and warmth of a large family. Sarah, or Sally as she becomes known, arrives like spring after a harsh winter. She brings with her not just her own children, but furniture, dishes, and most importantly, books. Real books with covers and pages that smell of ink and possibility. Abraham, who has been nearly wild with hunger for words, for stories, for knowledge, falls upon these treasures like a starving man at a feast. The Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, these become his companions in the long winter evenings. He reads by firelight, by candlelight, by any light he can find. His stepmother, recognizing something special in this strange, thoughtful boy, encourages his hunger for learning. She sees in his eyes the same flame that burns in the eyes of all true seekers, and she fans it with her understanding and support. Sally brings order to the household, but more than that, she brings love. She loves Abraham as if he were her own, and he, starved for maternal affection, responds with the devotion of a loyal son. Under her gentle guidance, the cabin transforms from a place of survival into a place of growth, where minds as well as bodies are nourished. Abraham grows tall in these years, shooting up like a young tree reaching for light. His body, always lean, becomes strong from the constant labor of clearing forest, splitting rails, and helping his father carve a farm from the wilderness. But it is his mind that truly flourishes. He reads everything he can find, borrowing books from neighbors, walking miles for the chance to hold a new volume in his hands. The stories he absorbs become part of his DNA, informing the way he sees the world and his place in it. From the Bible, he learns the rhythms of moral instruction, the power of parable and metaphor. From Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, he learns about the journey from darkness to light, about the importance of perseverance in the face of seemingly impossible obstacles. From Aesop, he learns that wisdom often comes disguised as simple stories, that the most profound truths can be found in the most humble packages. Neighbors begin to notice that young Abraham has a gift for words, for taking complex ideas and making them clear and compelling. He becomes the unofficial scribe of the community, writing letters for those who cannot write for themselves, reading documents aloud for those who cannot read. In these small acts of service, he begins to understand the democratic power of literacy, the way knowledge can be both a bridge and a ladder. The forest continues to teach him its lessons. In the patient way trees grow, ring by ring, toward the light, he learns about the importance of steady progress over dramatic gestures. In the way a forest fire clears underbrush to make room for new growth, he begins to understand that sometimes destruction is necessary for renewal. In the complex web of relationships that sustains the woodland ecosystem, he glimpses the interconnectedness of all life. As Abraham enters his teenage years, the cabin at Little Pigeon Creek holds within its walls a young man who is beginning to understand that his destiny lies beyond the boundaries of the wilderness. The books have shown him other worlds, other ways of being, and the hunger for knowledge has awakened in him a hunger for something more, for purpose, for meaning, for the chance to make a difference in the world. But he carries with him always the lessons of the forest, the wisdom of simple living, and the memory of his mother's gentle voice singing lullabies in the firelight. These will be his anchors in the storms to come, his touchstones in the great trials that await him. The wilderness has shaped him, but it has also prepared him for the larger wilderness of human society, where different kinds of trees grow and different kinds of axes are needed to clear the way for new growth. In the evenings, when the work is done and the family gathers around the fire, Abraham sometimes tells stories of his own devising. His voice, already showing hints of the power it will one day wield, carries his listeners away to other times and places. Sarah, watching from her chair by the hearth, sees in his eyes the light of something extraordinary, something that cannot be contained within the boundaries of any single cabin or clearing. The boy who once lay in his mother's arms, breathing the sharp air of a Kentucky winter, is becoming a man. And the man he is becoming carries within him the seeds of greatness, nurtured in the rich soil of hardship, watered by the tears of loss, and reaching always toward the light that beckons from beyond the forest's edge. There comes a moment in every young man's life when the horizon calls to him with a voice more compelling than any earthly music. For Abraham Lincoln, this moment arrived in the spring of 1830, when the ice had broken on the rivers and the world beyond Little Pigeon Creek seemed to pulse with possibility. The boy who had learned to read by firelight was becoming a man, and the wilderness that had shaped him was beginning to feel too small to contain his expanding spirit. The Lincoln family was moving again, this time to Illinois, following the ancient human rhythm of seeking better land, better opportunities, better tomorrows. The decision came partly from practical concerns. The Indiana soil was becoming exhausted, and legal troubles over land titles had created shadows of uncertainty. But perhaps it came also from something deeper, some restless gene that had driven the Lincoln bloodline westward for generations, always seeking the next valley, the next forest, the next frontier. Abraham, now 21 and towering over his contemporaries like a young oak among saplings, helped his father prepare for the journey. The wagon they loaded carried not just possessions but dreams, hopes, and the accumulated wisdom of a family that had learned to find home wherever they planted their roots. The oxen, patient and strong, stood ready to pull them toward another beginning. The journey to Illinois took them through landscapes that seemed to breathe with the promise of renewal. They crossed rivers that ran clear and cold, their waters carrying the song of distant mountains and the whispers of ancient glaciers. They passed through forests where the trees stood like columns in a vast cathedral, their branches interwoven overhead in Gothic arches that filtered the sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow. Abraham walked beside the wagon, his long legs easily keeping pace with the oxen. He carried with him the few books that had become his treasures, the Bible, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables, their pages worn soft from countless readings. But he also carried something else, a growing awareness that his future lay not in farming, but in something larger, something that would require all the wisdom he had absorbed from years of reading and thinking and observing the world around him. The family settled near Decatur, Illinois, in a cabin that Abraham helped build with his own hands. But even as he split rails and cleared land, his mind wandered to the rivers that flowed through this new country, like arteries carrying the lifeblood of commerce and communication. The Sangamon River, winding through the prairie like a silver snake, seemed to whisper of adventures and opportunities that lay beyond the horizon. It was Denton Offutt, a merchant with eyes that sparkled with entrepreneurial vision, who offered Abraham his first real taste of the wider world. Offutt needed someone to help him take a flatboat loaded with goods down the Sangamon to the Illinois River, then to the Mississippi, and finally to New Orleans. The journey would take weeks, carrying them through the very heart of America, and Abraham accepted the offer with the eagerness of a young man who had spent too many years looking at the same trees. The flatboat was a marvel of frontier engineering, a floating warehouse built from rough-hewn planks and held together with determination and prayer. It was 80 feet long and 18 feet wide, with a small cabin at one end and the rest of the deck loaded with barrels of pork, corn, and other produce from the Illinois frontier. Abraham, along with his cousin John Hanks and his stepbrother John Johnston, would guide this vessel through hundreds of miles of river, navigating currents, sandbars, and the complex geography of human settlements along the waterway. The first part of the journey down the Sangamon was an education in patience and problem-solving. The river, swollen with spring rains, carried them forward with deceptive ease at first. Abraham learned to read the water's mood, to understand the difference between the laugh of shallow riffles and the deep whisper of channels carved by centuries of patient flow. He learned to use the long steering oar called a sweep, to feel through the wood the river's intentions and respond with the skill of a dancer following a partner's lead. But the Sangamon, like all rivers, had its moods and its mysteries. Near the village of New Salem, disaster struck with the suddenness of a thunderclap. The flatboat, caught on a mill dam that stretched across the river, hung precariously balanced with its bow on the dam and its stern filling with water. The cargo shifted, threatening to dump their entire load into the river, and for a moment it seemed that their journey would end before it had truly begun. Abraham, however, had learned in the wilderness that problems are simply puzzles waiting to be solved. While the townspeople of New Salem gathered on the banks to watch the drama unfold, he devised a solution that would be remembered and retold for years to come. He moved the cargo to the bow, lifting the stern out of the water, then bored a hole in the bow to let the water drain out. With the boat lightened and balanced, they were able to pry it loose from the dam and continue their journey. The people of New Salem, watching this display of calm thinking under pressure, took note of the young man who had solved the problem with such practical ingenuity. They would remember his name, and that memory would prove crucial in the years to come. But Abraham, focused on the journey ahead, pushed the flatboat back into the current and continued downstream, unaware that he had just performed his first public service for the community that would soon become his home. The Illinois River, when they reached it, was a different creature entirely, broader, deeper, more confident in its purpose. Here the flatboat found its natural rhythm, and Abraham found his natural element. The river carried them past forests and prairies, past settlements that clung to the banks like children to their mothers' skirts. Each bend revealed new vistas, new possibilities, new reminders of the vast scale of the American continent. At night, they would tie up at wooded islands or friendly landings, and Abraham would lie on his back looking up at stars that seemed close enough to touch. The night sounds of the river, the lap of water against the hull, the distant cry of night birds, the whisper of wind through the rigging, became the lullabies of his young manhood. He felt connected to something vast and eternal, part of the great flow of life that moved through the American heartland like blood through veins. The Mississippi, when they finally reached it, was a revelation. Broader than any river Abraham had ever imagined, it carried within its brown waters the sediment of half a continent. This was the great highway of America, the liquid road that connected the wilderness of the north with the exotic ports of the south. Steamboats churned up and down its length, their smokestacks painting the sky with signatures of human ambition and mechanical progress. As they floated south through the heart of America, Abraham absorbed lessons that would shape his understanding of the nation for the rest of his life. He saw the prosperity of river towns built on commerce and transportation. He witnessed the complex dance of different cultures and languages mixing in the great melting pot of the Mississippi Valley. And he saw with his own eyes the institution of slavery that would one day tear the nation apart. In New Orleans, that most exotic of American cities, Abraham walked streets that seemed to pulse with the rhythms of different worlds. The French Quarter, with its wrought iron balconies and mysterious courtyards, spoke of European elegance transplanted to American soil. The markets, filled with goods from around the world, demonstrated the power of trade to connect distant peoples and places. And the slave markets, where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, showed him the moral contradiction at the heart of American civilization. The journey back to Illinois was made by steamboat, and Abraham marveled at the power of steam to drive a vessel upstream against the current. This was the future, he understood, not the muscle-powered flatboat with its dependence on wind and current, but the machine that could impose human will upon natural forces. The age of steam was dawning, and with it would come changes that would transform not just transportation, but the very nature of American society. When Abraham finally returned to the Lincoln family cabin, he carried with him more than just the wages from his river journey. He carried memories of a larger world, an understanding of the nation's geography and its possibilities, and a growing awareness of the moral challenges that lay ahead. The boy who had learned to read by firelight had become a young man who had seen the great river that connected all of America, and that vision would inform every decision he would make in the years to come. The flatboat journey had been more than an adventure. It had been an education in the truest sense, a classroom without walls where the lessons were written in water and wind, in the faces of strangers and the rhythms of commerce. Abraham had learned that America was not just a place but a process, not just a destination but a journey, and that his own destiny was somehow connected to the great democratic experiment that was unfolding along the rivers and in the forests of the American heartland. In the evenings, when the family gathered around the fire, Abraham would tell stories of his river journey, his voice carrying his listeners away to the exotic ports and mysterious bayous of the Deep South. But even as he spoke of adventure and discovery, part of his mind was already turning toward the future, toward the challenges and opportunities that awaited him in the years to come. The river had shown him the shape of America, and now he was ready to help shape America's destiny. There are places that call to us across the years, places where our true selves are waiting to be discovered, like seeds buried in fertile soil. For Abraham Lincoln, that place was New Salem, Illinois, a small frontier town that clung to the banks of the Sangamon River like a child to its mother's hem. When he arrived there in the summer of 1831, stepping off Denton Offutt's steamboat like a traveler entering a new world, he had no way of knowing that this humble collection of log cabins and dirt streets would become the crucible in which his character would be forged. New Salem was young, even by frontier standards. Founded just 2 years earlier by James Rutledge and John Cameron, it existed in that magical moment when a settlement still dreams of becoming a city, when every cabin raised and every business opened feels like a vote of confidence in the future. The town perched on a bluff overlooking the Sangamon, its 25 families bound together by the shared hope that their river would become a highway of commerce, their village a hub of prosperity. Abraham came to New Salem as clerk in Offutt's store, a position that placed him at the very center of the community's social and economic life. The store, with its wooden floors that creaked underfoot and its shelves lined with goods from the wider world, became his university. Here he learned the art of dealing with people, the delicate balance of trust and skepticism that governs all human commerce. He weighed out flour and sugar, measured yards of cloth, and extended credit to neighbors who promised to pay after harvest. But it was not just commerce that educated Abraham in those early days. The store served as the town's unofficial social center, where men gathered in the evenings to share news, tell stories, and engage in the democratic art of conversation. Abraham, with his gift for listening and his growing talent for storytelling, became a favorite among these informal gatherings. His stories, often humorous and always insightful, drew listeners like moths to a flame. The townspeople of New Salem quickly discovered that their newest resident possessed an unusual combination of physical strength and intellectual curiosity. Abraham could split rails with the best of them, could lift a whiskey barrel by himself, could wrestle any challenger to the ground. But he was also the man they sought out when they needed a letter written, a document read, or a complex problem solved. In him, they found that rare combination of brain and brawn that frontier communities valued above all else. Among the citizens of New Salem, Abraham encountered individuals who would shape his understanding of the world and his place in it. There was Dr. John Allen, the town's physician, who possessed a library that seemed like a treasure trove to the young man hungry for knowledge. Jack Kelso, the town's philosopher and fisherman, introduced Abraham to the poetry of Robert Burns and William Shakespeare, opening his mind to the music of language and the power of words to capture the deepest truths of human experience. But perhaps the most significant relationship Abraham formed in New Salem was with Anne Rutledge, daughter of the town's co-founder. Anne possessed a beauty that was more than physical. She had the kind of luminous intelligence that made her presence felt in any room. She was educated, well-read, and possessed of a gentle wisdom that complemented Abraham's more angular intellect. Their courtship, conducted in the formal manner of the frontier, was a dance of minds as much as hearts. Anne saw in Abraham something that perhaps he had not yet recognized in himself, a capacity for greatness that transcended the boundaries of their small world. She encouraged his political ambitions, supported his desire for education, and believed in his potential with a faith that was both inspiring and humbling. Their love story, played out against the backdrop of New Salem's hopeful years, became part of the town's mythology, a romance that seemed to embody the community's own dreams of transformation and growth. The Sangamon River, which had brought Abraham to New Salem, became central to his understanding of both opportunity and limitation. He joined efforts to improve the river's navigation, believing that commerce and transportation were the keys to the region's prosperity. He studied the river's moods, learned to read its seasonal changes, and became an advocate for the internal improvements that would connect frontier communities to the broader currents of American life. In 1832, Abraham made his first foray into politics, running for the Illinois General Assembly on a platform of river improvements and education. Though he lost that first election, finishing 8th in a field of 13 candidates, he received 277 of the 300 votes cast in New Salem, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned from his neighbors. The campaign taught him valuable lessons about the art of democratic persuasion, the importance of understanding his constituents' needs and concerns. The Black Hawk War of 1832 provided Abraham with his first taste of military service. Elected captain of his volunteer company, he led his men through the Illinois wilderness in pursuit of the Sauk warrior Black Hawk and his followers. Though Abraham saw no actual combat, the experience taught him about leadership, about the weight of responsibility for other men's lives, and about the complex relationships between white settlers and Native Americans. When Abraham returned from the war, he found New Salem changed in subtle but significant ways. The town's initial optimism was beginning to give way to a more realistic assessment of its prospects. The Sangamon River, despite all efforts to improve it, remained unreliable for navigation. Other towns, with better transportation connections, were beginning to surpass New Salem in population and prosperity. The dream of becoming a great commercial center was slowly fading, replaced by the more modest goal of simple survival. It was during this period that Abraham experienced one of the most profound losses of his young life. Anne Rutledge, the woman who had believed in his potential and supported his dreams, fell ill with typhoid fever in the summer of 1835. Abraham watched helplessly as the disease consumed her vitality, her luminous spirit gradually dimming like a candle flame in a closing room. When she died in August, something in Abraham died with her. The grief that followed Anne's death was unlike anything Abraham had experienced since his mother's passing. He walked the hills around New Salem like a man lost in a wilderness of sorrow, unable to find his way back to the world of the living. Friends worried about his sanity, his ability to carry on, but gradually, like a plant growing toward light, he began to heal. The healing came not through forgetting, but through integration, through finding a way to carry Anne's memory as a source of strength rather than despair. The years following Anne's death were years of transformation for Abraham. He began to study law in earnest, borrowing books from John Stewart, a Springfield attorney who recognized his potential. He read Blackstone's commentaries, studied the principles of jurisprudence, and began to understand the law not just as a collection of rules, but as a system for ordering human relationships in a just and equitable manner. In 1834, Abraham was elected to the Illinois General Assembly, beginning a political career that would span the rest of his life. His campaigns were exercises in democratic education, opportunities to engage with constituents about the issues that mattered most to their daily lives. He supported internal improvements, public education, and the gradual expansion of political rights. His speeches, delivered from courthouse steps and in country schoolhouses, began to demonstrate the rhetorical power that would one day move a nation. The New Salem years were also years of personal growth and self-discovery. Abraham learned to navigate the complex social world of frontier democracy, to balance competing interests, and find common ground among diverse constituencies. He developed the patience and wisdom that would serve him well in the greater challenges that lay ahead. He learned that leadership was not about imposing his will, but about helping others discover their own best interests. As the 1830s drew to a close, it became clear that New Salem's days as a viable community were numbered. The Illinois legislature had approved the construction of a new state capital at Springfield, and the town that had once dreamed of commercial greatness was slowly emptying as residents moved to more promising locations. Abraham, now a licensed attorney and successful politician, made the decision to leave New Salem for Springfield, where greater opportunities awaited. On a spring morning in 1837, Abraham loaded his few possessions into a wagon and prepared to leave the town that had been his home for 6 transformative years. As he looked back at the bluff where New Salem clung to the banks of the Sangamon, he carried with him not just memories but the essential elements of the man he had become. The frontier had taught him about democracy, about the dignity of common people, about the power of education and hard work to transform lives and communities. The boy who had arrived in New Salem as a store clerk was leaving as a man prepared to take his place in the larger world. He had learned to read not just books, but people, not just words, but the deeper currents of human motivation and desire. He had experienced love and loss, success and failure, and had emerged with a deeper understanding of the human condition. The wilderness had shaped him, but New Salem had refined him, preparing him for the greater wilderness of state politics and national leadership that lay ahead. In the years to come, as Abraham Lincoln rose to national prominence, he would often think back to his New Salem days with a mixture of nostalgia and gratitude. The town that had given him his start in life had long since vanished, its buildings scattered and its streets reclaimed by prairie grass. But the lessons he had learned there, about democracy, about leadership, about the fundamental decency of ordinary people, remained with him always, informing every decision he would make as he guided the nation through its greatest crisis. The river that had brought him to New Salem continued to flow, carrying with it the dreams and disappointments of a bygone era. But Abraham Lincoln, shaped by its currents and strengthened by its challenges, was ready to answer the call of a larger destiny. The man who would one day preserve the Union had been forged in the crucible of frontier democracy, tempered by loss and strengthened by the unwavering faith of a small community that had believed in his potential, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Springfield in 1837 was a town caught between its frontier past and its urban future, a place where mud streets and wooden sidewalks coexisted with the grand ambitions of a new state capital. When Abraham Lincoln arrived on that April morning, riding into town with all his possessions in saddlebags that could barely contain his lanky frame, he was entering a world that pulsed with the energy of democracy in motion. The town stretched along the prairie like a promise written in wood and brick, its buildings rising from the Illinois earth with the confidence of a people who believed deeply in their own destiny. The new State House, still under construction, stood at the center of it all like a temple to democratic ideals, its dome reaching toward a sky that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Here among the lawyers and legislators, the merchants and mechanics, Abraham would learn the intricate dance of law and politics that would define the rest of his life. His first stop was Joshua Speed's General Store, where the proprietor offered him lodging above the shop in exchange for companionship and conversation. Speed, a soft-spoken Kentuckian with gentle eyes and a philosopher's temperament, became more than a landlord. He became the closest friend Abraham would ever know. Their relationship, forged in the lamplight of long evening conversations, was built on a foundation of shared books, mutual respect, and the kind of deep understanding that comes only between kindred spirits. The room above Speed's store was sparse but welcoming, furnished with the simple necessities of bachelor life. From its windows, Abraham could watch the rhythms of Springfield society unfold below, the morning bustle of merchants opening their shops, the afternoon parade of politicians and lawyers making their rounds, the evening gathering of citizens who came to exchange news and opinions in the democratic tradition of the American town square. Abraham's law practice began modestly, in partnership with John Stewart, a man who had recognized his potential during the New Salem years. Their office, located near the courthouse, became Abraham's second university, where he studied the practical application of legal principles to the messy realities of human conflict. He learned that the law was not just about statutes and precedents, but about understanding people, their motivations, their fears, their hopes for justice in an imperfect world. The legal profession in frontier Illinois was unlike anything that exists today. Lawyers rode the circuit, traveling from county to county, as the court system made its rounds through the rural districts. Abraham embraced this nomadic life with the enthusiasm of a man who had grown up among people who measured wealth not in dollars, but in stories, not in possessions, but in experiences that enriched the soul. The circuit took him through landscapes that rolled like gentle waves across the Illinois prairie, past farmhouses where lamplight glowed warm against the gathering dusk, through county seats where the arrival of the court brought the excitement of a traveling circus. He traveled with other lawyers in a fraternal caravan, sharing meals and lodgings, swapping stories and legal strategies, forming bonds that transcended professional rivalry. Judge David Davis presided over the 8th Judicial Circuit like a benevolent patriarch, and Abraham quickly became one of his favorites. Davis saw in the young lawyer from New Salem something that others sometimes missed, a combination of intellectual rigor and intuitive wisdom that made him equally effective in simple debt cases and complex constitutional questions. Under Davis's tutelage, Abraham learned not just the mechanics of legal practice, but the deeper art of judicial temperament. In the courtrooms of rural Illinois, Abraham discovered his gift for connecting with juries. His storytelling ability, honed in the country stores and taverns of his youth, translated perfectly to legal advocacy. He could take the most complex legal concept and illustrate it with a homespun analogy that made perfect sense to farmers and mechanics. His humor, never cruel but always insightful, could defuse tension and redirect attention to the essential issues at stake. One case that became legendary throughout the circuit involved Abraham's defense of a man accused of murder. The prosecution's key witness claimed to have seen the crime clearly by moonlight, but Abraham had consulted an almanac and discovered that the moon had not risen until well after the alleged time of the incident. His dramatic revelation in court, pulling the almanac from his coat pocket like a magician producing a dove, secured his client's acquittal and demonstrated his meticulous attention to detail. But it was not just in dramatic moments that Abraham excelled. His practice included countless mundane cases, property disputes, debt collections, divorce proceedings, the ordinary legal business that forms the foundation of any attorney's career. He approached each case, no matter how small, with the same careful preparation and genuine concern for his client's welfare. He understood that for the people involved, no case was routine, no legal problem trivial. The evenings in Springfield brought different pleasures and challenges. Abraham joined the Young Men's Lyceum, where the town's educated citizens gathered to debate the great questions of the day. Here he delivered his first major public address, speaking on the perpetuation of our political institutions, with a passion and eloquence that marked him as a rising star in Illinois politics. In that speech, delivered in January 1838, Abraham warned of the dangers facing American democracy. He spoke of the mobocratic spirit that threatened to undermine the rule of law, and of ambitious men who might seek to make their mark by destroying rather than preserving the institutions built by the founding generation. His words proved prophetic, anticipating the crisis that would eventually tear the nation apart and require his own leadership to heal. The social world of Springfield offered opportunities for the kind of refined companionship that had been rare in Abraham's frontier upbringing. He was welcomed into the homes of the town's leading families, where he encountered women of education and sophistication who challenged his assumptions and broadened his understanding of what marriage and partnership might mean. Yet for all his success in society, he remained somewhat awkward in romantic matters, his natural shyness compounded by the grief he still carried for Anne Rutledge. It was at a dance in the winter of 1839 that Abraham first encountered Mary Todd, a vivacious young woman from Kentucky who had come to Springfield to live with her sister. Mary was everything that Anne Rutledge had not been: sophisticated, well-educated, politically ambitious, and possessed of a quick wit that could match Abraham's own. She came from a prominent family, spoke French, and had attended the best schools available to young women of her generation. Their courtship was complicated from the beginning, marked by the kind of intense attraction and fundamental differences that make some relationships feel like beautiful disasters waiting to happen. Mary was drawn to Abraham's intelligence and humor, his obvious potential for greatness. Abraham was fascinated by Mary's sophistication and her unshakable belief in his destiny, but they were also profoundly different in temperament and background, and their relationship would be marked by periods of passionate connection, alternating with painful separation. The crisis came in January 1841, when Abraham, overwhelmed by doubts about his feelings and his fitness for marriage, broke their engagement. The decision plunged him into a depression so severe that friends feared for his mental stability. He called it the fatal 1st of January, and for months afterward he struggled with what he described as the hypo, a black melancholy that seemed to drain all joy and purpose from his life. Joshua Speed, watching his friend's suffering with deep concern, proved to be Abraham's salvation during this dark period. Speed's own romantic struggles provided a framework for understanding the relationship between love and fear, between commitment and freedom. Through long conversations and patient friendship, Speed helped Abraham understand that his depression was not a sign of weakness, but a natural response to the overwhelming complexity of adult emotional life. The healing process was gradual, like the slow return of spring after a particularly harsh winter. Abraham threw himself into his legal practice with renewed energy, taking on more challenging cases and expanding his reputation throughout central Illinois. He continued his political activities, serving in the state legislature and becoming one of the leading Whig voices in Illinois politics. But the question of Mary Todd remained unresolved, a source of ongoing uncertainty and regret. The law became Abraham's refuge during this period, offering the kind of intellectual challenge and moral purpose that helped restore his confidence in himself and his future. He took on cases that allowed him to advocate for the principles he believed in most deeply: the rule of law, the rights of ordinary citizens, the importance of honest dealing in both private and public affairs. His reputation for integrity became as important as his skill as an advocate, earning him the nickname Honest Abe that would follow him throughout his career. In the courtroom, Abraham learned lessons that would serve him well in the greater conflicts to come. He learned that winning was less important than being right, that the most powerful arguments were often the simplest, and that juries responded to sincerity more than to cleverness. He learned to listen carefully to opposing counsel, to understand their arguments before attempting to refute them, and to concede points when concession served the cause of justice. The circuit life also taught him about the vast diversity of American society, about the dreams and struggles of ordinary people trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. He met German immigrants learning to navigate American law, Irish laborers fighting for fair wages, farmers struggling with debt and weather, and the complexities of agricultural commerce. Each case added to his understanding of the American experiment, of the challenges facing a democracy built on the principle that all people are created equal. As the 1830s gave way to the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln had established himself as one of Illinois' most respected attorneys and most promising politicians. But the personal questions that had driven him to the edge of despair remained unresolved. The law had given him purpose and direction, but it had not given him the companionship and emotional fulfillment that his nature craved. The man who could solve the legal problems of others seemed unable to solve the riddle of his own heart. Yet even in his uncertainty, Abraham was growing into the leader that America would need in its darkest hour. The skills he was learning in the courtrooms of Illinois, the ability to see both sides of complex questions, the talent for finding common ground among conflicting interests, the deep respect for law and constitutional government, were preparing him for challenges that no one could yet imagine. The prairie wind that swept across Springfield carried with it the scents and sounds of a young nation still defining itself, still working out the practical implications of its founding ideals. Abraham Lincoln, walking the muddy streets of the state capitol with his long coat flapping behind him like wings, was both a product of that process and one of its most important architects. The boy from the log cabin was becoming a man capable of preserving the Union and extending the promise of freedom to all Americans. In the quiet hours of evening, when the day's legal business was done and Springfield settled into the peaceful rhythms of small-town life, Abraham would often walk alone through the streets, thinking about the future and his place in it. The stars above seemed to whisper of destinies yet to be fulfilled, of challenges yet to be faced, of a greatness that lay hidden in the heart of the prairie, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself to the world. Love, when it finally arrives after a long winter of the heart, can feel like spring rain on parched earth, gentle at first, then overwhelming in its power to transform the landscape of the soul. For Abraham Lincoln, that transformative rain came in the form of a second chance with Mary Todd, a reunion that would prove to be one of the most important decisions of his life. The reconciliation began quietly, as the most significant changes often do. Eliza Francis, wife of the editor of the Springfield Journal, noticed that both Abraham and Mary seemed trapped in a limbo of regret and longing. With the gentle interference that sometimes characterizes true friendship, she began inviting them both to social gatherings at her home, creating opportunities for conversation without the pressure of formal courtship. The evening gatherings at the Francis house became a sanctuary where Abraham and Mary could rediscover what had drawn them together in the first place. Mary's quick wit and political acumen complemented Abraham's more measured wisdom, while his humor and storytelling ability brought out a softer, more relaxed side of her personality. They found themselves debating politics, discussing literature, and sharing dreams for the future with the intensity of two people who had learned, through separation, how rare it was to find genuine intellectual companionship. The attraction that reignited between them was deeper than their first romance had been, tempered by suffering and strengthened by a more mature understanding of love's complexities. Abraham had learned, through his period of depression and recovery, that emotional vulnerability was not weakness but strength. Mary had learned that her own happiness was too precious to be sacrificed to social expectations or family pressure. Their second courtship moved with the measured pace of two people who understood the gravity of the commitment they were contemplating. They walked together through Springfield's muddy streets, talking about everything from Shakespeare's sonnets to the proper role of government in a democratic society. Mary's belief in Abraham's political destiny remained unwavering, but now it was balanced by a deeper appreciation for the man behind the ambition. On November 4th, 1842, on a day when autumn painted the Illinois landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married in the parlor of the Edwards Mansion. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended by close friends and family members who had watched their courtship with a mixture of hope and concern. Abraham, dressed in his best black suit, spoke his vows with the solemnity of a man who understood that he was not just taking a wife, but entering into a partnership that would shape the rest of his life. Mary, radiant in a white muslin dress with a simple veil, brought to their union not just her love, but her absolute faith in Abraham's greatness. She saw in him possibilities that he himself sometimes doubted, and her confidence would prove to be one of his most valuable assets in the challenging years ahead. She was intelligent, well-educated, and politically sophisticated in ways that complemented his own frontier wisdom and practical experience. Their first home was a modest cottage on Jackson Street, a simple frame house that Mary transformed with her talent for creating warmth and beauty from the simplest materials. The house, though small, became a gathering place for Springfield's political and social elite, where Mary's skill as a hostess and Abraham's reputation as a storyteller created an atmosphere that was both refined and welcoming. Marriage brought new rhythms to Abraham's life, new responsibilities and new sources of joy. He discovered that Mary's belief in his potential was not just romantic idealization, but practical support. She encouraged his political ambitions, helped him navigate the complex social world of Springfield society, and provided the kind of stable home life that allowed him to focus his energies on his growing law practice and public career. Their first child, Robert Todd Lincoln, was born in August 1843, bringing with him all the wonder and terror that accompanies the arrival of a first baby. Abraham, who had grown up in a world where children were expected to contribute to family survival from an early age, was amazed by the luxury of being able to simply love and protect his son without requiring anything in return. He would spend hours playing with Robert, telling him stories, and marveling at the rapid development of the young mind. The responsibilities of fatherhood deepened Abraham's understanding of the stakes involved in political decisions. Every law he helped write, every case he argued, every political position he took had implications not just for abstract principles, but for the world his son would inherit. This personal dimension added urgency and emotional weight to his commitment to justice and democratic government. Mary proved to be a formidable political partner with an intuitive understanding of the social dynamics that shaped political careers. She hosted dinner parties where important conversations could unfold away from the formal constraints of public meetings. She cultivated relationships with the wives of influential men, understanding that in 19th century society, women's networks often carried as much political weight as men's formal organizations. But marriage also brought challenges that tested both partners in unexpected ways. Mary's social ambitions sometimes clashed with Abraham's more democratic instincts. She came from a world where status and position mattered deeply, while he remained fundamentally committed to the frontier ideal that a person's worth should be measured by character rather than birth or wealth. These differences in perspective led to tensions that would persist throughout their marriage. Abraham's growing reputation as a lawyer brought increased income and social standing, but it also demanded extensive travel on the legal circuit. For months at a time, he would be away from home, riding from courthouse to courthouse across central Illinois. Mary, left alone with household responsibilities and the challenges of raising young children, sometimes felt abandoned and unappreciated. The loneliness of these separations tested her resilience and their relationship. Their second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, was born in March 1846, bringing new joy, but also new worries. Eddie, as he was called, was a delicate child who seemed to catch every illness that passed through Springfield. Abraham, who had grown up in the robust health of frontier life, was unprepared for the constant anxiety that came with caring for a sickly child. Mary, drawing on her own experiences with illness in her family, became fiercely protective and increasingly worried about her children's welfare. The late 1840s marked a period of significant growth in Abraham's political career. In 1846, he was elected to represent Illinois' 7th District in the U.S. House of Representatives, fulfilling a dream that had sustained him through years of state-level politics. The election victory was sweet, but it came with the sobering realization that success in national politics would require even greater sacrifices from his family. The decision to move to Washington for Abraham's congressional term was not made lightly. Mary was excited about the opportunity to live in the nation's capital, to be part of the social and political world that revolved around the seat of government. But Abraham worried about uprooting his family, about the costs of maintaining two households, and about the effect that Washington's political atmosphere might have on his children's upbringing. In the end, they decided to make the move together, renting rooms in a boarding house near the Capitol where other congressmen and their families lived during legislative sessions. The arrangement was cramped and sometimes uncomfortable, but it allowed the family to stay together during Abraham's first and only term in Congress. Washington in the 1840s was a city of contradictions, where the marble monuments to democratic ideals coexisted with the brutal reality of slavery. Abraham was struck by the sight of slave markets operating in the shadow of the Capitol, by the way the nation's highest principles were daily contradicted by its most shameful practices. The experience deepened his moral opposition to slavery, while also teaching him about the practical political constraints that limited what could be accomplished through legislative action alone. Mary thrived in Washington's social environment, attending receptions and dinner parties, where she could exercise her considerable talents as a conversationalist and hostess. She formed friendships with the wives of other politicians, building relationships that would prove valuable throughout Abraham's career. But she also witnessed firsthand the vicious nature of political competition, the way personal attacks and party loyalty could override considerations of justice and the common good. Abraham's congressional term was marked by his opposition to the Mexican War, a position that was unpopular with many of his constituents, but reflected his deep conviction that the conflict was unjust and unconstitutional. His spot resolutions, demanding that President Polk identify the exact spot where American blood had been shed on American soil, demonstrated his commitment to truth and accountability in government, even when such commitment came at personal political cost. The experience of serving in Congress taught Abraham valuable lessons about the nature of democratic government, and the challenges of translating principles into practical policy. He learned that compromise was not betrayal, but necessity, that progress often came in small increments rather than dramatic gestures, and that the art of politics required patience, persistence, and the ability to maintain long-term vision while dealing with short-term pressures. When his congressional term ended in 1849, Abraham faced a choice that would define the next phase of his life. He could continue pursuing national political office, risking further separation from his family and the possibility of continued political defeats. Or he could return to Springfield, focus on his law practice, and build the kind of secure, prosperous life that would allow him to provide for his family's needs while serving his community in less dramatic but equally important ways. The decision to return to Springfield was made with Mary's full support, though both of them understood that it represented a temporary retreat rather than permanent retirement from political ambition. Abraham's experience in Washington had convinced him that the great questions facing the nation, particularly the question of slavery's expansion, would eventually force him back into the political arena. But for now, family responsibilities and financial necessities took precedence over political dreams. The return to Springfield felt like coming home after a long and sometimes difficult journey. Their house on Jackson Street welcomed them back with familiar comforts and the promise of a more settled domestic life. Abraham threw himself into his law practice with renewed energy, taking on more complex cases and building a reputation that extended far beyond Illinois. Mary focused on creating the kind of home that would serve as a foundation for whatever challenges the future might bring. As the 1840s drew to a close, Abraham Lincoln had established himself as a successful lawyer, devoted husband, and loving father. The boy who had grown up in a one-room cabin now lived in a comfortable middle-class home surrounded by books, blessed with a family that brought meaning to all his endeavors. But even in the contentment of domestic success, he remained aware that greater challenges awaited, that the nation was moving toward a crisis that would test every principle he held dear. The marriage that had begun with such uncertainty had proven to be one of the foundation stones of Abraham's character. Mary's unwavering belief in his destiny had given him the confidence to pursue goals that might otherwise have seemed impossible. Her social skills had opened doors that his frontier background might have kept closed. Her love had provided the emotional security that allowed him to take the risks necessary for greatness. In the quiet evenings at home, when the day's work was done and the children were asleep, Abraham and Mary would often sit together planning for the future, dreaming of the contributions they might make to their community and their nation. The partnership they had forged through trial and commitment would soon be tested by challenges greater than anything they had yet faced, but it would prove strong enough to sustain them through the greatest crisis in American history. There are seasons in a man's life when the world seems to pause, holding its breath before great changes sweep across the landscape like storms building on distant horizons. For Abraham Lincoln, the early 1850s were such a season, a time of apparent quiet that masked the gathering forces that would soon transform both his personal destiny and the fate of the nation he loved. The Lincoln family had settled into the comfortable rhythms of middle-class Springfield life. Their home on 8th and Jackson, expanded and improved over the years, had become a haven where Abraham could retreat from the demands of his growing law practice, and Mary could exercise her considerable talents as hostess and homemaker. The house breathed with the contentment of a family that had found its place in the world, its rooms filled with the laughter of children and the quiet satisfaction of domestic success. Abraham's law practice had flourished beyond anything he might have imagined during his struggling years in New Salem. He had become one of Illinois' most sought-after attorneys, known throughout the state for his honesty, his skill in the courtroom, and his ability to explain complex legal concepts in terms that ordinary people could understand. The circuit riding that had once been a necessity had become a choice, and he continued to travel from courthouse to courthouse, not from financial need, but from genuine love of the work and the people it allowed him to serve. The Illinois Central Railroad had hired him as one of its chief attorneys, bringing with it not just substantial fees, but exposure to the complex legal questions surrounding the nation's rapid industrial development. Abraham learned to navigate the intersection of law and economics, to understand how legal decisions shaped the growth of commerce and industry. The railroad work taught him about the interconnectedness of American economic life, about the way local decisions could have national implications. But it was in the smaller cases, the everyday legal problems of ordinary citizens, that Abraham found his greatest satisfaction. He defended farmers in debt disputes, helped immigrants navigate the complexities of American law, and represented workers in cases against unscrupulous employers. Each case reinforced his belief in the fundamental dignity of common people and their right to equal treatment under the law. The children brought their own rhythms to the Lincoln household. Robert, now approaching adolescence, showed signs of his father's intelligence and his mother's social sophistication. Eddie, still delicate but growing stronger, filled the house with his laughter and curiosity. In 1850, their third son, William Wallace Lincoln, was born, a robust baby who seemed to embody all the energy and optimism of his frontier heritage. Willie, as he came to be known, quickly became the family favorite, blessed with his father's storytelling ability and his mother's charm. Mary had evolved into one of Springfield's most accomplished hostesses, and their home became a gathering place for the town's political and social elite. Her dinner parties were legendary for their combination of excellent food, stimulating conversation, and Mary's skill at bringing together people whose ideas might not otherwise intersect. Abraham, though sometimes uncomfortable with formal social situations, learned to appreciate the value of these gatherings for building the relationships that sustained both his legal practice and his political prospects. But beneath the surface contentment of these years, Abraham was aware of forces building that would soon disrupt the peaceful world he had created. The question of slavery, which had seemed settled by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, was beginning to reassert itself with new urgency. The acquisition of territory from Mexico had reopened debates about slavery's expansion, and politicians in Washington were struggling to find new compromises that could preserve the Union, while addressing the moral contradictions at the heart of American society. The Compromise of 1850, with its complex web of concessions to both North and South, had temporarily diffused the crisis, but Abraham could see that it had solved nothing fundamental. The Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northern citizens to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, had brought the moral reality of slavery into communities that had previously been able to ignore its existence. In Springfield and throughout Illinois, the sight of federal marshals hunting human beings like animals was creating a new awareness of slavery's brutality. Abraham had always opposed slavery on moral grounds, but his opposition had been tempered by respect for constitutional constraints and by his understanding of the practical difficulties involved in eliminating an institution so deeply embedded in American economic and social life. He believed that slavery was wrong, but he also believed that the Constitution protected it in states where it already existed. His hope had been that slavery would gradually die out, that economic and moral forces would eventually make it unsustainable. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 shattered that hope and transformed Abraham from a successful lawyer with political interests into a moral crusader driven by passion and principle. The act, sponsored by Stephen A. Douglas, repealed the Missouri Compromise, and opened the possibility that slavery might expand into territories where it had been prohibited for more than 30 years. The principle of popular sovereignty, letting the people of each territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, sounded democratic. But Abraham understood that it represented a fundamental abandonment of the moral position that slavery was wrong. The news of the Kansas-Nebraska Act reached Springfield on a spring day that should have been perfect for contemplating the simple pleasures of domestic life. Abraham was in his law office, working on a routine case, when a colleague brought word of Douglas's legislation. As he read the details, Abraham felt something awakening in him that had been dormant for years, a sense of moral urgency that demanded action regardless of personal cost. That evening, Abraham walked the streets of Springfield like a man wrestling with angels, his mind racing through the implications of what had happened. The careful balance that had preserved the Union for decades was being destroyed, and in its place was emerging a system that could lead to slavery's expansion throughout the American continent. The house divided that Jesus had warned could not stand was becoming a political reality, and Abraham began to understand that the time for compromise and gradualism was ending. The speech Abraham delivered at the Illinois State Fair in October 1854 marked his return to active politics and his emergence as a national voice in the debate over slavery. For hours he spoke to a crowd that grew larger as word spread through Springfield that Lincoln was making an important address. His voice, carrying the moral authority of deeply held conviction, dissected the Kansas-Nebraska Act with surgical precision while building a case for the fundamental incompatibility of slavery with American democratic ideals. Abraham argued that the founders had put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction by prohibiting its expansion and treating it as a necessary evil rather than a positive good. The Kansas-Nebraska Act reversed that policy, treating slavery as a matter of indifference and opening the possibility that it might become permanent and universal. He spoke of the monstrous injustice of slavery, of the way it violated the principle that all men are created equal, and of the danger it posed to the survival of democratic government. The speech was more than political argument, it was moral awakening. Abraham had found his voice and his mission, and those who heard him that day knew they were witnessing the emergence of a new kind of political leader, one who could combine practical wisdom with moral passion, who could speak to both the mind and the heart, who could articulate the deepest principles of American democracy in language that ordinary people could understand and embrace. The response to the speech was immediate and powerful. Republicans throughout Illinois began to speak of Abraham Lincoln as a potential candidate for higher office, and newspapers across the nation began to take notice of the prairie lawyer who could argue against slavery with such eloquence and force. But Abraham understood that speeches alone would not be enough to prevent the expansion of slavery or preserve the Union. He would need to enter the political arena as a candidate, risking the comfortable life he had built for the uncertain rewards of public service. The decision to seek the U.S. Senate seat held by Stephen Douglas was not made lightly. Abraham knew that challenging the little giant would be the political fight of his life, that it would require him to travel throughout Illinois, making the case for Republican principles to audiences that might not be ready to hear them. The campaign would be expensive, exhausting, and potentially damaging to both his law practice and his family life. But Mary, whose political instincts were as sharp as her social skills, urged him to make the race. She had always believed that Abraham was destined for greatness, and she could see that the slavery question was creating opportunities for leaders who could articulate a moral vision that transcended partisan politics. She was willing to make the necessary sacrifices, to endure the separations and uncertainties that would come with a statewide campaign, because she understood that this was Abraham's moment to step onto the national stage. The senatorial campaign of 1858 would test everything Abraham had learned about politics, law, and human nature during his years in Springfield. It would require him to synthesize his frontier wisdom with his growing understanding of constitutional law, his practical political skills with his moral convictions, his gift for storytelling with his capacity for rigorous logical argument. The boy, who had learned to read by firelight, was about to engage in a series of debates that would be remembered as among the greatest in American political history. As Abraham prepared for the campaign, he could feel the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The comfortable world of Springfield law practice and domestic contentment was giving way to something larger and more demanding. The nation was moving toward a crisis that would test every principle he held dear, and he was being called to play a role in that crisis that he could not yet fully imagine. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the house was still and his family slept peacefully around him, Abraham would sometimes stand at his bedroom window, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The same stars that had watched over his childhood in the Kentucky wilderness now witnessed his preparation for a battle that would determine the future of human freedom in America. The boy who had split rails was about to split the nation's conscience, forcing Americans to choose between the easy path of compromise and the difficult path of moral clarity. The awakening giant was stirring, preparing to stand up and be counted in the greatest moral crusade of his generation. The comfortable middle-class lawyer was about to become the voice of American conscience. The prairie politician was about to become the great emancipator, and the man who had learned to heal divisions in courtrooms and communities was about to undertake the task of healing a nation torn apart by its fundamental contradictions. The season of quiet preparation was ending, and the season of great deeds was about to begin. In the gathering dusk of American democracy, when shadows lengthened across the prairie and the very foundations of the republic seemed to tremble, there emerged a voice that would speak truth to a nation teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Abraham Lincoln, the rail-splitter-turned lawyer, stood at the threshold of greatness, his words about to echo through the corridors of history like thunder rolling across the Illinois sky. The Republican State Convention of 1858 met in Springfield on a June evening when the air hung heavy with the promise of storm. Delegates from across Illinois had gathered to nominate their candidate for the United States Senate, and the choice was unanimous. Abraham Lincoln would challenge Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, whose Kansas-Nebraska Act had reopened the wound of slavery and set the nation bleeding. Abraham rose to accept the nomination, carrying with him a speech that would define not just his campaign, but the moral terms of the national debate. His voice, when he began to speak, carried the weight of conviction earned through years of careful thought and moral struggle. The delegates, expecting the usual political rhetoric, found themselves listening to something far more profound, a prophet speaking to a people who had lost their way. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he declared, his words cutting through the humid air like lightning illuminating a landscape in crisis. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." The speech sent shockwaves through the political establishment. Even Abraham's supporters worried that he had gone too far, that his stark presentation of the choice facing America would alienate moderate voters who preferred the comfortable ambiguity of compromise. But Abraham understood something that his critics did not. The time for half measures was ending, and the American people needed a leader who would speak clearly about the moral crisis threatening to destroy their nation. The campaign that followed was unlike anything in American political history. Douglas, recognizing the threat posed by his challenger, agreed to a series of debates that would carry both men across Illinois and into the consciousness of a nation watching to see how democracy would address its greatest test. The 7 debates, held in towns from Ottawa to Alton, became a seminar in American political philosophy, a public examination of the principles upon which the Republic was founded. The crowds that gathered for these debates came not just from curiosity, but from a deep hunger for moral clarity in an age of confusion. They stood for hours in blazing sun and driving rain, farmers and merchants, immigrants and native-born Americans, all of them sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. These were not mere political speeches, but a national conversation about the meaning of America itself. In Ottawa, before 15,000 people gathered on a sweltering August day, Abraham faced Douglas's charge that he was a radical abolitionist seeking to destroy the Union for the sake of abstract principles. Abraham's response revealed the depth of his understanding of both law and human nature. He distinguished between believing that slavery was wrong and believing that the federal government had the power to eliminate it where it already existed. He wanted to prevent slavery's expansion, not because he hated the South, but because he loved America too much to watch it abandon its founding principles. At Freeport in the second debate, Abraham asked the question that would haunt Douglas for the rest of his career. Could the people of a territory lawfully exclude slavery before achieving statehood? Douglas's answer, that they could do so through unfriendly legislation, satisfied neither North nor South, and effectively ended his presidential ambitions. Abraham had forced his opponent to choose between his northern and southern supporters, demonstrating the political skill that would serve him well in the greater challenges ahead. The debates revealed 2 fundamentally different visions of America's future. Douglas advocated popular sovereignty and claimed indifference to whether slavery was voted up or down. Abraham argued that the nation could not remain indifferent to a moral evil, that the founders had put slavery on the path to ultimate extinction, and that Douglas's policies would make slavery permanent and national. Where Douglas saw a practical political solution, Abraham saw moral abdication. In Charleston, before an audience that included many Southern sympathizers, Abraham was forced to address the question of racial equality directly. His answer reflected both the political realities of his time and the evolution of his own thinking. He declared that he was not in favor of social and political equality between the races, but he insisted that in their natural right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men were created equal. It was a position that satisfied neither abolitionists nor slavery defenders, but it reflected Abraham's commitment to constitutional principles and his belief that moral progress must be grounded in legal reality. The final debate, in Alton, took place on a crisp October day when the Mississippi River reflected the golden light of autumn like molten metal. Here, Abraham delivered his most powerful statement of the moral principles at stake. He spoke of the difference between the right and the wrong, between treating slavery as an evil to be tolerated where it existed but prevented from spreading, and treating it as something so morally neutral that the nation could be indifferent to its expansion. That is the real issue, Abraham declared, his voice carrying across the crowd and down through the years. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the eternal struggle between these 2 principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. When the ballots were counted in November, Douglas retained his Senate seat by the narrow margin provided by the structure of Illinois legislative districts. Abraham had won the popular vote but lost the election, a result that might have ended the political career of a lesser man. Instead, it launched Abraham onto the national stage, as newspapers across the country reprinted excerpts from the debates and recognized that a new voice had emerged in American politics. The defeat was painful, but Abraham understood that he had accomplished something more important than winning office. He had articulated a moral vision that resonated with millions of Americans who were searching for leadership in a time of crisis. The debates had clarified the issues facing the nation and had established Abraham as the spokesman for the principle that democracy and slavery could not permanently coexist. The months following the senatorial campaign were a time of reflection and preparation. Abraham returned to his law practice, but his heart was no longer fully invested in the routine work of the courts. He had tasted the wine of national politics and had seen his own capacity to influence great events. The boy who had once dreamed of making his mark in the world now understood that his mark might be larger than he had ever dared imagine. Speaking invitations poured in from across the north, and Abraham found himself traveling to distant cities to address audiences hungry for the moral clarity he had demonstrated in the Douglas debates. In Cooper Union in New York City, before an audience of the Eastern intellectual elite, he delivered a speech that demonstrated his mastery of constitutional history and his ability to hold his own with the most educated men of his generation. The Cooper Union address was a tour de force of historical research and logical argument. Abraham traced the attitudes of the Founding Fathers toward slavery, demonstrating that they had consistently acted to limit its expansion and had never intended for it to spread throughout the territories. He dismantled the Southern argument that the Constitution protected slavery expansion, and he challenged the North to stand firm on principles while avoiding the extremes that might drive the South to secession. "Let us have faith that right makes might," he concluded, "and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." The speech was a triumph, establishing Abraham as a serious contender for the Republican presidential nomination and demonstrating that the prairie lawyer could hold his own in the most sophisticated political circles in the nation. As 1860 dawned, Abraham found himself being mentioned as a possible Republican nominee for president. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying, representing the fulfillment of dreams he had barely dared to dream, while also presenting challenges that seemed almost overwhelming. The idea that the boy from the log cabin might actually become President of the United States seemed to violate all the natural laws of American society, yet the events of the 1850s had created possibilities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Republican National Convention met in Chicago in May 1860 in a wooden structure called the Wigwam that had been built specifically for the occasion. Abraham was not the favorite for the nomination. That honor belonged to William Seward of New York, a man with greater experience and broader national recognition. But Abraham had advantages that his rivals lacked. He came from a crucial swing state. He had no record of extreme statements that might alienate moderate voters, and he had demonstrated the ability to articulate Republican principles in language that appealed to ordinary Americans. The convention was a masterpiece of political strategy orchestrated by Abraham's supporters, led by David Davis and Leonard Swett. They packed the galleries with Lincoln supporters, made careful deals with delegates from other states, and positioned their candidate as the man who could unite the party and win the election. When the balloting began, Seward led on the first ballot, but Abraham's support grew steadily, and on the third ballot he secured the nomination that would change his life forever. The news of Abraham's nomination reached Springfield by telegraph, and the city erupted in celebration. Cannons boomed, bells rang, and crowds gathered in the streets to cheer the man who had risen from rail splitter to presidential nominee. Abraham himself received the news at the Illinois State Journal office, where he had been waiting with friends for the results. His first words were characteristically humble. "There's a little woman at home who will be glad to hear this." Mary Lincoln was indeed glad, her faith in Abraham's destiny finally vindicated by events. But she was also apprehensive about the challenges that lay ahead, understanding better than most the personal costs that would come with the presidency. The comfortable life they had built in Springfield was about to be sacrificed on the altar of public service, and the family would never again know the simple pleasures of private life. The presidential campaign of 1860 was unlike any other in American history, complicated by the fact that the Democratic Party had split into northern and southern wings, each with its own nominee. Abraham faced not only Stephen Douglas representing Northern Democrats, but also John Breckinridge representing Southern Democrats, and John Bell representing the Constitutional Union Party. The four-way race reflected the deep divisions within American society and the difficulty of finding common ground on the slavery question. Abraham conducted what was called a front porch campaign, remaining in Springfield while surrogates carried his message across the North. He understood that anything he said might be misconstrued by his opponents or might provide ammunition for those who claimed he was a radical abolitionist. His silence was strategic, allowing voters to project their own hopes onto his candidacy while avoiding statements that might drive away moderate supporters. The campaign was marked by increasing threats from the South, where politicians and newspapers warned that Lincoln's election would be followed immediately by secession. Abraham tried to reassure Southern moderates that he had no intention of interfering with slavery, where it already existed. But his fundamental opposition to slavery's expansion made compromise impossible. The House divided was approaching the moment when it would have to choose between becoming all one thing or all the other. On Election Day, November 6, 1860, Abraham waited in Springfield as returns came in from across the nation. The results confirmed what the polls had suggested. He had won a decisive victory in the Electoral College while receiving less than 40% of the popular vote. The sectional nature of his victory, he won no southern states and appeared on the ballot in only a few, demonstrated the depth of the national division he would inherit as president. As the news of victory sank in, Abraham understood that he was about to face the greatest crisis in American history. South Carolina was already moving toward secession, and other southern states seemed likely to follow. The Union that had survived for more than 70 years was about to face its ultimate test, and the responsibility for preserving it would rest on the shoulders of a man who had never held executive office, who had served only one term in Congress, who had been born in a log cabin and educated in the school of hard experience. The boy who had learned to read by firelight was about to become the man who would preserve the Union and extend the promise of freedom to 4 million enslaved Americans. The rail splitter was about to split the nation in order to save it. The prairie lawyer was about to become the great emancipator, and the man who had always believed in the power of reason and moral suasion was about to discover that some conflicts can only be resolved through blood and sacrifice. In the quiet hours after his election, as Springfield celebrated around him, Abraham Lincoln looked toward Washington and the challenges that awaited him there. The comfortable world of Illinois law and politics was ending, and the greatest test of his life, and of American democracy itself, was about to begin. The house divided was about to fall, but from its ruins would rise a new birth of freedom that would transform both Abraham Lincoln and the nation he loved. The winter of 1860-61 was unlike any other in American memory, a season when the very air seemed to crackle with the electricity of approaching storm. In Springfield, snow fell silently on a town that had suddenly become the center of the American universe, its modest streets now walked by journalists and politicians from every corner of the nation, all seeking audience with the president-elect, who continued to live quietly in his frame house on 8th and Jackson. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter who would soon become the 16th President of the United States, moved through these final weeks in Springfield with the measured calm of a man who understood that history was watching his every gesture. He rose each morning before dawn, as had been his habit since childhood, and made his way through streets that now required protection from the crowds of well-wishers and curiosity seekers who gathered hoping for a glimpse of the man who would either save or destroy the Union. The office that had been secured for him in the state capital became a receiving room for the democracy, where farmers and senators, laborers and intellectuals came to offer advice, seek positions, or simply to shake the hand of the man who embodied their hopes for the future. Abraham listened to each visitor with the patience that had served him well on the legal circuit, understanding that in a democracy, leadership meant serving not just the powerful, but the powerless, not just the eloquent, but those who could barely articulate their dreams. Each morning brought news that seemed to confirm the nation's slide toward catastrophe. South Carolina had already seceded, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederate States of America was forming in Montgomery, Alabama, with Jefferson Davis as its president. Federal forts and arsenals were being seized, federal officials were being expelled, and the Constitution that Abraham had sworn to preserve and protect was being treated as a dead letter across the entire Lower South. The weight of these developments pressed upon Abraham like a physical burden, aging him visibly during the months between election and inauguration. Mary watched with growing concern as her husband struggled with decisions that would affect not just their family, but millions of Americans, slave and free, North and South. The presidency that had once seemed like the fulfillment of their highest ambitions now loomed like a mountain too steep to climb, too dangerous to leave unattempted. The advice Abraham received during these winter months was as varied as the American people themselves. Some urged compromise, suggesting that concessions to the South might prevent war and preserve the Union. Others demanded firmness, arguing that yielding to secession would destroy the principle of democratic government and set a precedent that would eventually tear the nation apart completely. Abraham listened to all perspectives while keeping his own counsel, understanding that the decision he ultimately made would be his alone to bear. The Crittenden Compromise, proposed by Senator John Jay. Crittenden of Kentucky offered the most substantial hope for peaceful resolution. It would have extended the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean, protecting slavery in territories south of the line while prohibiting it north of the line. For many Americans, it seemed like a reasonable solution that could preserve both union and peace. But Abraham understood that accepting the compromise would effectively surrender the principle that had brought the Republican Party into existence, that slavery should not be allowed to expand into new territories. In a series of private letters and carefully worded public statements, Abraham made his position clear. He would not compromise on the question of slavery extension. He was willing to support a constitutional amendment, protecting slavery where it already existed, willing to enforce the fugitive slave law despite his personal distaste for it, willing to consider any reasonable proposal that did not involve the expansion of slavery. But on the central question that had brought him to power, he would not yield. "The tug has to come," he wrote to a friend, "and better now than any time hereafter." The statement revealed the depth of his understanding of the crisis facing the nation. The fundamental contradiction between slavery and freedom could not be resolved through compromise because it was not a practical problem, but a moral one. Either America would become a nation truly dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, or it would become something else entirely. The farewell to Springfield came on a gray February morning when the Illinois prairie lay buried under a blanket of snow that seemed to muffle the very sounds of departure. At the Great Western Railroad depot, A crowd of neighbors and friends had gathered to see Abraham off on the journey that would carry him to Washington and into history. The special train that would bear him eastward waited like a mechanical beast, breathing steam into the cold air. Abraham stood on the rear platform of the train, looking out over the faces of people who had known him as neighbor, lawyer, and friend before the world knew him as president-elect. His farewell address, delivered in a voice heavy with emotion, captured the poignancy of the moment and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To this place, and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. The reference to little Eddie, who had died of typhoid fever in 1850, brought tears to many eyes and reminded everyone present that this departure represented not just a political transition, but a human journey fraught with personal sacrifice. Abraham was leaving behind not just a house but a home, not just a career but a life carefully constructed around the values of family, community, and simple human decency. As the train pulled away from Springfield, carrying Abraham toward his destiny, he stood at the window watching the familiar landscape scroll past like pages in a book of memories. The prairies where he had walked as a young man, the courthouse where he had argued his cases, the streets where his children had played, all of it was receding into the past, becoming part of a life that would soon seem as distant as a dream. The journey to Washington was planned as a triumph, a 12-day progress through the heartland of America that would allow the president-elect to show himself to the people and to reassure them of his commitment to preserving the Union. The route took the train through Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, with stops in major cities where Abraham would address crowds and participate in the democratic ritual of leadership transition. But the journey quickly became something more complex and troubling than a simple political procession. At every stop, Abraham faced crowds that reflected the deep divisions within Northern society. Some welcomed him as a savior who would preserve the Union and extend freedom to the enslaved. Others viewed him with suspicion, wondering whether this untested prairie politician possessed the skills necessary to navigate the crisis facing the nation. Still, others saw him as a dangerous radical whose election had precipitated the very crisis he now claimed he could solve. In Indianapolis, Abraham addressed the Indiana legislature and spoke of his hope that the crisis could be resolved without bloodshed. "I have said nothing but what I am willing to live by, and in the pleasure of Almighty God die by," he declared, his words carrying the gravity of a man who understood that his presidency might indeed require the ultimate sacrifice. The statement was both a promise and a prophecy, revealing his awareness that the path ahead might lead to martyrdom. The crowds that gathered at each stop were unlike anything America had ever seen. In Cincinnati, 100,000 people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the president-elect. In Columbus, despite freezing rain, thousands stood for hours waiting for the train's arrival. In Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York, the reception was so overwhelming that Abraham began to understand the weight of expectations that rested on his shoulders. But it was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that the journey took a darker turn. Alan Pinkerton, the detective hired to provide security for the president-elect, brought word of a plot to assassinate Abraham during his scheduled passage through Baltimore. The intelligence suggested that Confederate sympathizers planned to attack the train or to strike during the ceremonial procession through the city. The threat was credible enough that Abraham's advisors urged him to change his plans, to bypass Baltimore entirely or to pass through the city in secret. The decision to alter the schedule and travel through Baltimore under cover of darkness was one of the most difficult of Abraham's life. He understood the symbolic importance of showing courage in the face of threats, of demonstrating that the democratic process could not be intimidated by violence. But he also understood that his death before inauguration would plunge the nation into chaos and make civil war virtually inevitable. The secret passage through Baltimore in the early hours of February 23, 1861, became one of the most controversial episodes of Abraham's presidency before it even began. Traveling in disguise, accompanied only by Pinkerton and Ward Hill laymen, Abraham slipped through a city where Confederate sympathizers might have been waiting to strike. The episode was later ridiculed by his critics as evidence of cowardice, but those who understood the stakes recognized it as a necessary precaution that preserved the possibility of peaceful transition. When Abraham finally arrived in Washington on the morning of February 23rd, he found a city that seemed balanced on the edge of chaos. Rumors of plots and conspiracies filled the air. Federal buildings were under guard, and the very process of democratic government seemed under siege. The capital that should have been preparing for a peaceful inauguration was instead preparing for war, with soldiers patrolling the streets and artillery positioned to defend key installations. The Willard Hotel, where Abraham took up residence for the final days before his inauguration, became a fortress of democracy surrounded by uncertainty. Here, in ornate rooms that had witnessed decades of American political history, the president-elect met with congressional leaders, cabinet appointees, and ordinary citizens who sought to understand his intentions for the crisis ahead. The inaugural address that Abraham crafted during his final days at the Willard was perhaps the most important speech in American history, a document that would either provide a pathway to peace or serve as a declaration of war. Working late into the night, revising and refining each sentence, Abraham struggled to find words that would speak to both North and South, that would affirm his commitment to preserving the Union while leaving room for reconciliation. "We are not enemies but friends," he would declare from the steps of the Capitol. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. The words captured both Abraham's hopes and his understanding of the challenges ahead. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a Kentucky cabin was about to become the man who would preserve the Union through the greatest crisis in American history. The rail splitter was about to take up the burden of leadership at the moment when the house divided would finally be forced to stand or fall. As March 4, 1861, dawned gray and cold over Washington, Abraham Lincoln prepared to take the oath of office that would transform him from prairie lawyer to commander-in-chief of a nation at war with itself. The long journey from Springfield was ending, but the longer journey toward preserving the Union and extending freedom to all Americans was just beginning. The boy from the log cabin was about to become the great emancipator, and the man who had always believed in the power of words to heal divisions was about to discover that some wounds can only be healed through blood and sacrifice. The oath of office, spoken into the cold March air above a divided capital, fell from Abraham Lincoln's lips like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples across a nation poised between peace and war. As his hand rested upon the Bible, and his voice carried the ancient words across the crowd gathered before the Capitol, he could feel the weight of the Union settling upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from the dreams and sacrifices of 3 generations of Americans. Washington in March of 1861 was a city holding its breath, its residents wondering whether the magnificent dome rising above the Capitol would soon look down upon a foreign country or continue to shelter the government of a united people. Secession had already claimed 7 states, and Confederate batteries at Charleston were trained upon Fort Sumter, where a handful of Federal soldiers maintained their lonely vigil in what might become the flashpoint for continental war. Abraham moved into the executive mansion, not yet called the White House, carrying with him the simple faith that had sustained him through every crisis of his life, that right would ultimately triumph over wrong, that the American people would choose preservation over destruction when the choice was clearly presented, and that the Union, which had been conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, was worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it. The early days of his presidency were a baptism by fire that would have broken a lesser man. Every decision carried the weight of national survival. Every appointment was scrutinized for its potential impact on the delicate balance between war and peace. Every word was passed by journalists and politicians seeking signs of his intentions. Abraham discovered that the presidency was not merely an office, but a crucible in which character was tested and refined under pressures that few human beings could imagine. The crisis at Fort Sumter crystallized all the contradictions and tensions that had been building for decades. Major Robert Anderson and his small garrison held the fort in Charleston Harbor, while Confederate forces under General Pierre Beauregard demanded its surrender. Abraham faced an impossible choice: resupply the fort and risk being blamed for starting a war, or abandon it and acknowledge that federal authority had ceased to exist in the Confederate States. Abraham's solution was characteristically shrewd and morally clear. He would send provisions to the hungry garrison, but no military reinforcements, and he would notify the South Carolina authorities of his intentions. If the Confederates chose to fire upon ships carrying food to hungry soldiers, they would bear the responsibility for starting the war. If they allowed the resupply, the federal presence would continue, and negotiations might still be possible. The bombardment of Fort Sumter began at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, with the booming of Confederate cannons that echoed across Charleston Harbor like thunder announcing the arrival of America's greatest storm. For 34 hours, the guns spoke their deadly language while the nation watched and waited. When Major Anderson finally lowered the American flag in surrender, not a single life had been lost to enemy fire. But the Union had gained something more valuable than a fortress: the moral authority that comes from being attacked rather than attacking. Abraham's response to Sumter was swift and decisive. Within days, he had called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion, had begun organizing the military resources necessary to restore federal authority, and had demonstrated to the world that the United States government would not simply acquiesce to its own dissolution. The rail splitter, who had once wielded an axe to clear forests, was now wielding the power of the presidency to clear away the obstacles to national unity. But the call for volunteers precipitated the very crisis Abraham had hoped to avoid. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, which had previously rejected secession, now saw themselves faced with a choice between the Union and their southern neighbors. One by one, they cast their lot with the Confederacy, and the border between North and South hardened into a line that would soon be marked by blood and sacrifice. The early months of the war tested every assumption about American democracy and the nature of the conflict ahead. What had been expected to last 90 days stretched into months, then years, as both sides discovered that their opponents were neither as weak nor as demoralized as they had imagined. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 shattered Northern illusions about a quick victory and demonstrated that the Confederacy was prepared to fight with skill, determination, and courage. Abraham learned the hardest lessons of leadership during these early battles, watching from the War Department telegraph office as reports came in from fields where American boys fought and died for their competing visions of what America should become. He discovered that being commander-in-chief meant more than giving orders. It meant taking responsibility for every failure, every miscalculation, every life lost in service to the cause of Union. The general who dominated these early months was George B. McClellan, a brilliant organizer and trainer of troops who transformed the ragtag volunteers who had answered Abraham's call into the magnificent Army of the Potomac. McClellan was everything that Abraham was not. Young, handsome, imperious, possessed of absolute confidence in his own military genius. He was also maddeningly cautious, always finding reasons to delay action, always demanding more troops, more supplies, more time to prepare for the decisive battle that somehow never came. The relationship between Abraham and McClellan became one of the defining tensions of the war's early years. Abraham, who understood that time favored the Confederacy and that Northern public opinion would not tolerate indefinite delay, pressed constantly for action. McClellan, who believed that one perfectly prepared campaign could end the war decisively, resisted what he saw as political interference with military strategy. Their correspondence, marked by growing frustration on both sides, revealed the difficulty of maintaining civilian control over military operations in a democracy at war. The Peninsula Campaign of 1862 epitomized both the promise and the frustration of McClellan's leadership. Moving his army by sea to the Virginia Peninsula, McClellan came within 6 miles of the Confederate capital at Richmond before being turned back by Robert E. Lee, a general who understood that audacity often trumps caution in warfare. Abraham watched with growing impatience as his largest army was outmaneuvered by a smaller force and forced to retreat to the safety of Northern-controlled territory. But the war was about more than military campaigns. It was about the fundamental question of what America would become. The institution of slavery, which had been the underlying cause of the conflict, became increasingly central to Union strategy as Abraham and his advisors realized that the Confederacy's ability to use enslaved labor freed white Southerners for military service. The contraband policy, which treated escaped slaves as confiscated enemy property, evolved gradually into a recognition that emancipation might be both a military necessity and a moral imperative. Abraham's thinking about slavery evolved under the pressure of events and the weight of moral responsibility. The man who had once argued that his primary obligation was to preserve the Union began to understand that the Union could not be truly preserved without addressing the moral contradiction that had divided it. Slavery and freedom could not permanently coexist. The house divided would indeed become all one thing or all the other. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, issued after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, was perhaps the most momentous decision of Abraham's presidency. After months of careful consideration and consultation with his cabinet, he announced that on January 1st, 1863, all slaves in states still in rebellion would be declared free. The proclamation transformed the war from a conflict about preserving the Union into a crusade for human freedom. The decision to issue the proclamation was not made lightly. Abraham understood that it would fundamentally alter the nature of the war, making reconciliation more difficult while also making the conflict a moral crusade that would appeal to the conscience of the world. He knew that it would cost him political support among Democrats and conservative Republicans who had supported the war for union but not for abolition. But he also knew that it was the right thing to do, that the time had come to act upon the principles that had brought the Republican Party into existence. The months between the preliminary proclamation and its implementation were filled with debate, negotiation, and soul-searching. Some urged Abraham to reconsider, arguing that emancipation would prolong the war and make reconciliation impossible. Others pressed him to go further, to declare immediate freedom for all enslaved people regardless of geography. Abraham held to his course, understanding that the proclamation represented the art of the possible in the context of American law and politics. On New Year's Day 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in the upstairs study of the Executive Mansion, his hand trembling slightly from fatigue and the weight of history. As his pen moved across the paper, 4 million human beings moved from bondage toward freedom, and America took a giant step toward fulfilling the promises made in the Declaration of Independence. The boy who had grown up in a society that accepted slavery as natural and inevitable had become the great emancipator, the man who would be remembered for striking the chains from millions of his fellow human beings. The signing was both an ending and a beginning. It marked the end of America's attempt to maintain a democracy half slave and half free, but it also marked the beginning of the greater challenge of creating a society truly based on equality and justice. Abraham understood that proclaiming freedom was only the first step. The harder task would be building a nation where that freedom could be meaningful and permanent. As 1863 dawned over a nation transformed by war and emancipation, Abraham Lincoln had evolved from the prairie lawyer who had taken the oath of office less than 2 years earlier. The weight of the Union had aged him visibly, carving lines of care and responsibility into his face, but it had also revealed the greatness that had always been latent in his character. The man who had once split rails to clear land was now splitting the nation to save it, and the process was revealing both the terrible cost and the ultimate necessity of the struggle for human freedom. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a Kentucky cabin had become the leader of the free world, and his light was beginning to illuminate not just America, but all humanity's struggle toward a more perfect union. The house divided was being rebuilt on a foundation of equality and justice, and Abraham Lincoln was proving to be not just its architect, but its cornerstone, the man whose character and vision would determine whether government of the people, by the people, and for the people would perish from the earth or experience a new birth of freedom. The winter of 1863 settled over Washington like a shroud woven from sorrow and determination, its cold winds carrying the scent of wood smoke from military camps and the distant echo of artillery that had become the heartbeat of a nation at war with itself. Abraham Lincoln moved through the Executive Mansion like a man carrying the weight of 4 million newly freed souls on his shoulders, the Emancipation Proclamation having transformed him from politician to prophet, from president to great emancipator. The proclamation had changed everything and nothing. On paper, millions of enslaved people were now free, but the reality was that most remained in bondage, protected by Confederate armies that showed no sign of surrendering. The war that had begun as a conflict to preserve the Union had become a revolution to transform America, and Abraham understood that there could be no turning back from the path he had chosen. The military situation as 1863 began offered little comfort to a president desperate for victory. The Army of the Potomac, despite its size and training, remained stalled in Virginia, unable to decisively defeat Robert E. Lee's smaller but more aggressive Army of Northern Virginia. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant was slowly tightening his grip around Vicksburg, the Confederate fortress that controlled the Mississippi River. But progress was measured in months rather than weeks, and Northern patience was wearing thin. Abraham had learned to read the war through the telegraph messages that arrived at all hours in the War Department, their terse language carrying news of victories and defeats, advances and retreats, casualties that mounted with each passing day. He haunted the telegraph office like a ghost seeking news from the world of the living, his tall frame bent over the clicking machine that connected him to the scattered armies fighting for the Union's survival. The burden of command showed in every line of Abraham's face, every gesture of his long hands, every word of his increasingly infrequent public statements. Mary worried about his health, about the way he seemed to be consuming himself in service to the cause, eating little, sleeping less, aging years with each passing month. Their son Tad had become his constant companion, the boy's innocent chatter providing brief respites from the overwhelming weight of presidential responsibility. But it was Willie's death in February 1862 that had truly broken something in Abraham's heart, a grief so profound that it threatened to overwhelm even his capacity for endurance. The boy who had been the family's brightest light, possessed of his father's storytelling gift and his mother's social graces, succumbed to typhoid fever in the executive mansion, his death transforming the house into a place of mourning from which it would never fully recover. Abraham's grief for Willie became entangled with his sorrow for all the young men dying in the war, all the families receiving news that their sons would never come home, all the mothers who would spend the rest of their lives wondering what might have been. The personal and the political merged in his consciousness until he could no longer separate his private pain from his public responsibility, his individual loss from the nation's collective sacrifice. The Battle of Chancellorsville in May 1863 demonstrated once again Lee's tactical brilliance and the Union Army's inability to translate numerical superiority into decisive victory. Despite outnumbering the Confederates 2-1, General Joseph Hooker's army was outmaneuvered and forced to retreat, leaving the road to Pennsylvania open for Lee's second invasion of the North. Abraham received the news with the weary resignation of a man who had learned that hope and disappointment were constant companions in wartime. But Lee's victory at Chancellorsville came at a terrible cost: the death of Stonewall Jackson, shot by his own men in the confusion of night fighting. Abraham understood the strategic implications immediately. Jackson had been Lee's most trusted lieutenant, his loss weakening the Confederate Army at the moment when it was preparing for its boldest gamble. The war had become a calculus of loss, each side measuring its capacity to endure suffering against its opponent's will to continue fighting. The news from Gettysburg arrived in fragments throughout the first days of July 1863, each telegram adding pieces to a puzzle that would determine the war's trajectory. Lee had invaded Pennsylvania with his entire army, seeking the decisive victory that might force the North to negotiate peace. General George Meade, newly appointed to command the Army of the Potomac, had moved to intercept him, and the two armies had collided at a small college town that would become forever sacred in American memory. Abraham spent those July days in the telegraph office, watching the dispatches arrive like a man observing his own surgery. The first day brought news of fierce fighting, with both armies converging on Gettysburg in a battle that neither side had planned, but both were determined to win. The second day brought reports of desperate Confederate assaults on the Union flanks, attacks that came heartbreakingly close to breaking the Federal line. The third day brought word of Pickett's charge, Lee's final gamble, 15,000 Confederate soldiers advancing across open ground toward the Union Center in one of the war's most magnificent and tragic spectacles. When the smoke cleared on July 4, 1863, Independence Day, Lee's army was retreating toward Virginia, leaving behind more than 28,000 casualties and the Confederate cause's best hope for victory. Abraham understood immediately that Gettysburg was more than a tactical victory. It was the beginning of the end, the moment when the Confederacy's capacity to wage offensive war was finally broken. But he also understood that thousands of American boys lay dead on Pennsylvania fields, their sacrifice the price of preserving the Union and extending freedom to the enslaved. The news from Vicksburg arrived almost simultaneously, Grant's long siege finally succeeding in capturing the fortress that had controlled the Mississippi for 2 years. With Vicksburg's fall, the Confederacy was cut in two, its western territories isolated from Richmond's control. The twin victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the war's turning point, but Abraham knew that turning points in war meant little without the will to follow them through to conclusion. The invitation to speak at the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery came as a minor addition to Abraham's schedule, a brief appearance at a ceremony honoring the men who had died in Pennsylvania's fields. Edward Everett, the era's most celebrated orator, would deliver the main address. Abraham was asked merely to offer a few appropriate remarks. He agreed readily, understanding that the occasion would provide an opportunity to help the nation understand the meaning of the sacrifice made on those hallowed grounds. Abraham wrote his address carefully, crafting each sentence with the precision of a man who understood that words could be as powerful as weapons, that the right combination of phrases could heal wounds that bullets had torn open. The speech was brief, less than 3 minutes, but it captured the essence of what the war had become and what it might yet accomplish. In 10 sentences, he transformed a battlefield dedication into a meditation on democracy, sacrifice, and national renewal. 77 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd of mourners and dignitaries gathered among the graves. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The opening words established both a timeline and a moral framework connecting the battle at Gettysburg to the broader American experiment in self-government. The address's central insight was revolutionary, that the living could not consecrate the battlefield because the dead had already done so through their sacrifice. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The words transformed the ceremony from an exercise in civic ritual into a recognition of sacred sacrifice. Abraham's conclusion elevated the dedication into a call for national renewal, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The phrase "new birth of freedom" captured the transformation that the war had wrought, the way emancipation had fulfilled the promises implicit in the Declaration of Independence. The immediate reaction to the Gettysburg Address was mixed. Some newspapers praised it, while others criticized its brevity or its political implications. But Abraham understood that he had achieved something more important than immediate acclaim. He had provided the American people with a framework for understanding their sacrifice, a way of seeing the war as something more than a political conflict, as a step toward the realization of humanity's highest aspirations. The autumn of 1863 brought both military progress and political challenges that tested Abraham's leadership in new ways. General Grant's victories in the West had established him as the Union's most successful commander, but the Army of the Potomac remained bogged down in Virginia, unable to deliver the knockout blow that would end Confederate resistance. Abraham began to consider promoting Grant to overall command of Union forces, a decision that would require him to override the objections of Eastern generals who viewed the Western commander as a crude brawler, unsuited for sophisticated strategic thinking. The political situation was equally challenging. The 1863 elections had shown growing Democratic strength in key states like Ohio and Pennsylvania, where voters were expressing their weariness with a war that seemed to have no end. Clement Vallandigham, the most prominent of the Copperheads who opposed the war, had been arrested for treason and then dramatically banished to the Confederacy, creating a martyr for Democrats who argued that Abraham had become a dictator trampling on constitutional rights. Abraham's response to these challenges revealed the political skills that had served him well throughout his career. Rather than defending his war policies in abstract terms, he explained them in the concrete language of democratic governance and moral responsibility. In his letter to Erastus Corning and the Albany Democrats, he argued that the Constitution was not a suicide pact, that measures necessary to preserve the Union must be considered constitutional even if they would be inappropriate in peacetime. The question of Reconstruction, what to do with the southern states once they were restored to the Union, became increasingly urgent as Union armies occupied larger portions of Confederate territory. Abraham's approach was characteristically pragmatic. He wanted to make it as easy as possible for southern states to return to the Union, while ensuring that the gains of emancipation could not be reversed. His 10% plan, announced in December 1863, offered pardons to Confederates who would take an oath of loyalty and established procedures for readmitting states once 10% of their 1860 voters had taken the oath. Radical Republicans in Congress viewed Abraham's approach as too lenient, arguing that the southern states should be treated as conquered territories and that Reconstruction should be used to fundamentally transform southern society. Abraham understood their concerns, but believed that magnanimity was essential to lasting peace, that the Union could only be truly restored if Southerners felt they had a stake in its future rather than a grievance against its present. The promotion of Ulysses S. Grant to General-in-Chief in March 1864 marked a turning point in both the war's conduct and Abraham's role as Commander-in-Chief. Grant understood, as previous commanders had not, that the Union's advantages in men and materiel could only be decisive if applied consistently and simultaneously across all theaters. His strategy of coordinated offensives would finally force the Confederacy to fight the kind of war it could not win, a war of attrition that would exhaust its limited resources. The Overland Campaign that began in May 1864 demonstrated both Grant's strategic vision and his willingness to accept casualties that previous commanders had found unacceptable. The battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor cost the Union Army more than 50,000 casualties in 6 weeks, losses that led newspapers to dub Grant a butcher and politicians to question whether the price of victory was too high to pay. Abraham supported Grant through this period of intense criticism, understanding that the general was finally implementing the kind of war strategy that could end Confederate resistance. When critics accused Grant of callousness, Abraham defended him as a commander who understood that accepting heavy casualties in the short term was the only way to minimize total casualties over the duration of the war. The mathematics of war were brutal but inescapable. The Union could replace its losses while the Confederacy could not. The siege of Petersburg that began in June 1864 marked the beginning of the war's final phase, though few understood it at the time. Grant had finally pinned Lee's army in defensive positions that negated its tactical superiority, forcing the Confederates to fight the kind of positional warfare that favored the Union's advantages in artillery and supply. But the siege also meant that the war would continue indefinitely, testing Northern patience and Abraham's political survival as the 1864 election approached. William Tecumseh Sherman's march through Georgia provided the dramatic victory that Abraham needed to demonstrate progress toward final victory. Sherman's capture of Atlanta in September 1864 was perfectly timed to influence the presidential election, proving that the Union was indeed winning the war and that Confederate resistance was crumbling. The telegram announcing Atlanta's fall, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won," may have been the most important 4 words of Abraham's presidency. The 1864 election was effectively a referendum on the war and on Abraham's leadership, with Democrats nominating George McClellan on a platform that called for immediate peace negotiations with the Confederacy. Abraham understood that defeat would mean not just the end of his presidency, but the effective end of the war effort, that a Democratic victory would likely result in Confederate independence and the permanent establishment of slavery in North America. Abraham's renomination by the Republican Party, now calling itself the National Union Party, to emphasize its bipartisan appeal, was not assured. Radical Republicans had considered challenging him with John C. Fremont, while conservative Republicans worried that his emancipation policies had made victory impossible. Abraham's selection of Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat from Tennessee, as his running mate demonstrated his commitment to national unity and his understanding that victory required support from Democrats as well as Republicans. The election results in November 1864 provided Abraham with a decisive mandate to continue the war until final victory. He won 55% of the popular vote and 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21, a margin that reflected Northern determination to see the war through to its conclusion. Perhaps more importantly, soldiers in the field voted overwhelmingly for Abraham, demonstrating that those who were actually fighting the war supported its continuation under his leadership. Sherman's march to the sea, completed in December 1864 with the capture of Savannah, provided the perfect punctuation to Abraham's electoral victory. The general's telegram, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah," captured the momentum that was finally carrying the Union toward victory. The Confederacy was being split and conquered, its ability to resist systematically destroyed by a war strategy that targeted not just armies, but the economic and psychological foundations of rebellion. As 1864 drew to a close, Abraham Lincoln could see the end of the war approaching like dawn after the longest night in American history. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a Kentucky cabin had become the man who would preserve the Union and extend freedom to 4 million enslaved Americans. The rail splitter had split the nation to save it, and the house divided was finally being rebuilt on a foundation of equality and justice. But even in the hour of approaching triumph, Abraham understood that the greatest challenges lay ahead. Winning the war was only the beginning. The harder task would be winning the peace, building a reunited nation where former enemies could live together as fellow citizens, where former slaves could enjoy the fruits of freedom, where the principles of democracy could flourish in a society finally freed from the moral contradiction of slavery. The crucible of war had tested every aspect of Abraham's character and found it sufficient for the greatest crisis in American history. The man who had once wondered whether he possessed the strength to lead a nation through civil war had proven himself worthy of comparison with Washington and Jefferson, worthy of a place among the founders of American democracy. The great emancipator was about to become the great reconciler, the president who would not only preserve the Union, but transform it into something closer to the founders' highest aspirations. The final winter of the war settled over Washington like a benediction, its snows covering a capital that had learned to live with the rhythms of conflict, but was now beginning to dream of peace. Abraham Lincoln, gaunt and careworn, but sustained by the certainty of approaching victory, moved through the executive mansion with the measured step of a man who could finally see the end of America's greatest trial, approaching like dawn after an endless night. The re-election had been more than a personal vindication. It was a mandate from the American people to complete the work of preserving the Union and extending freedom to all who dwelt within its borders. Abraham understood that he had been granted not just 4 more years, but the opportunity to guide the nation through the complex process of reconstruction, to help heal the wounds that 4 years of civil war had opened in the American body politic. Sherman's march through Georgia, had been completed with the capture of Savannah, a Christmas gift that symbolized the Confederacy's inability to protect its own heartland from Union armies. Now Sherman was turning north toward the Carolinas, carrying with him the devastating lesson that rebellion could not be sustained when the civilian population lost faith in their government's ability to protect them. The psychological warfare that Sherman pioneered was as effective as any military campaign in demonstrating that Confederate resistance was futile. In Virginia, Grant continued his patient siege of Petersburg, slowly tightening the noose around Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. The once magnificent force that had dominated eastern battlefields for 3 years was now reduced to holding defensive positions, its ranks thinned by casualties and desertion, its supply lines increasingly vulnerable to Union cavalry raids. Abraham could read the signs clearly. The end was approaching, though he knew that cornered armies could fight with desperate ferocity. The second inaugural address that Abraham crafted for March 4, 1865, reflected his understanding that victory would bring responsibilities as great as those of war itself. He had learned, through 4 years of unimaginable trial, that leadership in a democracy required not just the courage to make difficult decisions, but the wisdom to help citizens understand the meaning of their shared sacrifice. The address, delivered on a day when Washington's muddy streets reflected the gray sky like mirrors of national exhaustion, was unlike any inaugural speech in American history. Instead of celebrating victory or promising future prosperity, Abraham offered a meditation on the meaning of the war and the challenges of Reconstruction. His words carried the weight of biblical prophecy, the sense that America was being judged by a power higher than any earthly government. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, he observed, of North and South, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The passage revealed Abraham's understanding that slavery had corrupted both slaveholder and nation. That judgment belonged to God rather than to human tribunals. The speech's most famous passage captured Abraham's vision for Reconstruction. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The words malice toward none with charity for all became the defining phrase of Abraham's approach to Reconstruction, though they would prove impossible to implement in practice. He understood that lasting peace required not just military victory, but psychological reconciliation, that the Union could only be truly restored if former Confederates could be persuaded to accept not just defeat, but the moral transformation that victory represented. The rapid collapse of Confederate resistance in the spring of 1865 surprised even Abraham, who had expected the war to continue for several more months. Sherman's march through the Carolinas had broken the back of Southern resistance, while Grant's persistence at Petersburg had finally exhausted Lee's capacity to maintain defensive positions. When Lee's army began its final retreat toward Lynchburg, Abraham understood that the end had come at last. The news of Richmond's fall reached Washington on April 3, 1865, bringing with it scenes of celebration that the capital had not witnessed since the war began. Church bells rang throughout the city, cannons boomed in salute, and crowds gathered in the streets to sing patriotic songs and cheer the news that the Confederate capital had finally fallen. Abraham received the news with quiet satisfaction, understanding that the symbolic value of capturing Richmond was as important as its strategic significance. Abraham's visit to Richmond on April 4th just hours after its capture, was one of the most extraordinary moments in American history. Walking through the streets of the former Confederate capital with just a small escort, he was surrounded by newly freed slaves who fell to their knees in gratitude and white residents who watched in sullen silence. The image of the great emancipator walking through the city that had been the symbol of slavery's defiance captured the magnitude of the transformation that the war had wrought. The meeting between Abraham and Confederate officials in Richmond, though brief and informal, demonstrated his commitment to reconciliation rather than revenge. He urged Virginia's legislature to reconvene and take the state out of the rebellion, promising that Reconstruction could be accomplished quickly and relatively painlessly if Southern leaders would accept the reality of defeat and the necessity of emancipation. His magnanimity in victory reflected his understanding that lasting peace required healing rather than punishment. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, brought the formal end of Confederate resistance in Virginia and effectively concluded the Civil War. Lee's decision to surrender rather than continue guerrilla warfare demonstrated the kind of statesmanship that Abraham had hoped to see from Southern leaders. Grant's generous terms — Confederate soldiers could keep their horses and return home, officers could retain their sidearms — reflected Abraham's policy of making reconciliation as easy as possible. Abraham received news of Lee's surrender with profound relief and gratitude, understanding that the great work of his life was finally complete. The Union had been preserved, slavery had been abolished, and the principle that democracy could survive its greatest test had been vindicated. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a Kentucky cabin had become the man who saved American democracy and extended its promises to all Americans regardless of race. The days following Appomattox were filled with celebration, but also with the complex work of transition from war to peace. Abraham worked on plans for Reconstruction that would balance the need for justice with the requirement for reconciliation. He understood that the freed slaves would need protection and assistance as they transitioned to freedom, but he also believed that magnanimity toward former Confederates was essential to lasting peace. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Abraham and Mary attended a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater, seeking a brief respite from the overwhelming responsibilities of victory. The play was a comedy, and Abraham's laughter at its humor was noted by observers who remarked on how relaxed and happy the president seemed now that the war was finally ending. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and prominent actor who had been planning assassination for months, struck during the third act of the play. His shot, fired at point-blank range into the back of Abraham's head, was timed to coincide with one of the play's biggest laughs when the sound would be masked by audience reaction. The cry of "Sic semper tyrannis," thus ever to tyrants, that Booth shouted as he leapt to the stage revealed his belief that he was striking a blow for Southern liberty. Abraham was carried unconscious to a boarding house across the street from the theater, where doctors worked through the night to save his life. But the wound was mortal, the bullet having destroyed too much of his brain to permit survival. As dawn broke over Washington on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln drew his final breath, his death transforming him from president to martyr, from political leader to American saint. The news of Abraham's assassination spread across the nation like wildfire, creating a wave of grief unlike anything in American history. The man who had preserved the Union and freed the slaves had been struck down just as his greatest work was being completed, his death seeming to confirm that in a fallen world, those who serve the cause of justice often pay the ultimate price for their service. The funeral journey from Washington to Springfield took Abraham's body through the cities where he had campaigned and spoken, allowing millions of Americans to pay their respects to the man who had saved their nation. The train that carried his coffin became a moving shrine, its passage marked by crowds that stood in silent tribute to the fallen president. In city after city, Americans filed past his coffin in lines that stretched for miles, each mourner understanding that they were saying farewell, not just to a man but to an era. Mary Lincoln, devastated by the loss of her husband and the destruction of her family's future, never fully recovered from the tragedy. The woman who had believed so fervently in Abraham's destiny found herself widowed at 56, left to raise their surviving son alone while coping with grief that threatened to destroy her sanity. Her later years were marked by instability and sorrow, a tragic epilogue to a love story that had been central to one of America's greatest lives. Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Springfield on May 4, 1865, his body interred in Oak Ridge Cemetery beneath a simple monument that bore his name and dates. But his true monument was the transformed nation he left behind, America where slavery had been abolished and the principle of equality had been written into the Constitution, where government of the people, by the people, and for the people had proven that it would not perish from the earth. The boy who had learned to read by firelight in a Kentucky cabin had become the great emancipator, the preserver of the Union, the American Moses who had led his people through the wilderness of civil war toward the promised land of freedom and equality. His death made him a martyr, but his life had already made him immortal, his words and deeds becoming part of the permanent heritage of human liberty. In the quiet of Oak Ridge Cemetery, where prairie winds whisper through the trees that shade his tomb, Abraham Lincoln sleeps the sleep of those who have completed their work and found it good. The rail splitter had split the nation to save it. The prairie lawyer had become the voice of human conscience, and the man who had always believed in the better angels of human nature had proven that those angels could triumph even over the demons of hatred and division. The house divided had been rebuilt on a foundation of equality and justice, and Abraham Lincoln's sacrifice had made possible a new birth of freedom that would inspire not just Americans, but all humanity in their ongoing struggle toward a more perfect union. The boy from the log cabin had become the savior of the Union and the great emancipator, his life a testament to the democratic faith that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they are guided by moral conviction and sustained by unshakable faith in the principles of human equality and divine justice. Rest now, dear dreamer, in the peace of those who have fought the good fight and kept the faith. Let these stories of America's greatest president carry you gently toward your own dreams, where the better angels of our nature forever triumph over the darkness that would divide us. In sleep, as in life, we are all children of the same democracy that Abraham Lincoln died to preserve, all inheritors of the freedom that his sacrifice made possible. Sleep well and dream of a more perfect union.